but came out in a different form as part of a project with the Wits School of Governance, as well as Telkom, the SA Future Economy project. But as Niravia said, this work forms part of the first chapter of my dissertation, where I largely try to understand the causal effect of the national lockdown policy in particular, as opposed to other confounders that I'll talk about a bit later. But yeah, thank you for having me and thank you for attending. Cool, let me just share my screen. All right, can everyone, just confirming everyone can see the slideshow and not the presenter's view?
Yes, I can see the slideshow.
Fantastic, cool. And I apologize if anyone hears any puppy barking in the background. My partner's busy looking after our neighbor's puppy and I couldn't say no. I'm sure you won't mind. All right, great. So again, this is part of a working paper that we published earlier in the week entitled COVID-19 and the Labour Market, Estimating the Causal Employment Effects of South Africa's National Lockdown. It's work that I did with my co-authors, Professor Haroon Borat, Mr. Robert Hill, and Benjamin Stanwix, a few of which I believe are also attending. And we're all based at the Development and Policy Research Unit, based in the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. Great. So I'll start off just by giving an introduction and background to the study and the motivation. And then I'll describe the data that we use, which is primarily household survey data or the labor force data, the QLFS. And then I'll go into a few details with respect to the identification strategy of how we came to, or how we attempt to estimate this causal effect. I won't go into too much detail there because I'm aware that the audience is a mixture of academics, perhaps policymakers, generally interested public or other stakeholders. So I think I'll leave some time at the end for some questions if anyone wants any further detail on that. And then I'll present some descriptive statistics and our main results, and then we'll discuss the conclusion. Cool. All right, so we're all very much well aware by now that in response to the pandemic, the South African government in March very quickly implemented a relatively stringent, by international standards, national lockdown, both to delay and curb the spread of the virus and prepare the necessary public health infrastructure, public and private health infrastructure. We always knew that the lockdown would have substantial short and long-term economic costs, and we, as labor economists, see this very starkly presented in the labor market. A few other authors based at Wits, David Francis et al., earlier last year used pre-crisis QLFS data and estimated that just about 40% of workers under the most stringent lockdown level and level 5 were permitted to work. So the curious nature of our lockdown policy and that of that around the world was that it restricted not only job seekers from participating in the labor market, but also the previously employed, of course. And of course, as I said earlier, we always expected this to result in substantial cuts on both the extensive and intensive margins. And what I mean by extensive margins is simply outcomes such as employment, unemployment, being economically inactive, etc. And by intensive margins, I'm referring to outcomes amongst those who remain employed. So for instance, lots of studies have already shown, using multiple data sources, that we've seen a substantial reduction in employment, in the number of people employed, a reduction in the number of people looking for jobs, as well as a number of people who have remained employed but have experienced a reduction in working hours, as well as a reduction in their wages. This has been coupled by an increase in inactivity, which is characteristic of the national lockdown policy, where people are again unable to participate in the labor market either by looking for jobs or remaining in employment. Then by the end of the year, we've experienced a partial but noticeably uneven recovery, which I can touch on a bit later. But overall, we've seen that the immediate short-term job losses have been concentrated amongst those groups who were unsurprisingly already vulnerable in the labor market to begin with. So these include individuals who are based in poorer households, those who were less skilled and earned lower wages, the informally employed, as well as women, particularly the poorest women towards the bottom of the wage distribution. So we know that a large amount of important work has already been done and is ongoing, but all these studies are largely descriptive in nature. And the implications of this is that a simple comparison of the number of people employed, for instance, in 2020 Q1, prior to the lockdown, compare that to the following quarter, cannot necessarily be directly attributable to our national government's lockdown policy, right? Because we know that a whole host of events took place between the transition of these quarters across the world and domestically speaking, obviously largely related to the pandemic. These include, for instance, but are not limited to, mortality and morbidity effects on the labor market, behavioral responses of both consumers and producers, for instance, fear or risk aversion in participating in the labor market or economy in general. Domestic policy, which includes notably the national lockdown policy, as well as foreign policy, which includes other countries' lockdown policies, as well as disruptions to supply chains. So we argue in this paper that these factors are important to consider when we consider just how much net employment changed from one quarter to the next, and how much of the job loss we can actually attribute to our government's national lockdown policy relative to this collection of other factors that took place at the same time. So in this paper, we try to employ a novel quasi-experimental econometric technique whereby we use representative labor force data, and we try to use this technique to estimate the causal effect on the national lockdown policy in particular. And our outcome of interest for now is employment, but in future work, we hope to extend this work to other outcomes, such as the probability of being unemployed or inactive, as well as intensive margin outcomes like wages and working hours. And I'll explain our identification strategy soon. So before heading straight into the descriptive and quasi-experimental results, just a quick note on the data sources. So for this study, we primarily use the first 2 quarters of 2020 from the quarterly labor force survey from Stats.SA. So as I'm sure many of us are well aware and used to using this data, the QLFS is a household survey, individual level household survey, conducted every quarter since 2008, and typically has a sample between 60 and 70,000 people in about 30,000 dwelling units in the country. What's important to mention here is that there have been important differences in the 2020 QLFS data, largely arising because of the pandemic, specifically from Q2 onwards. So first of all, towards the end of March, which is towards the end of the first quarter, we know that Stats.SA had to stop surveying the households towards the end of the quarter, which resulted in 2% of the households that were originally going to be sampled in Q1 not being surveyed. Stats.SA ended up not replacing, but using the relevant information from the respective individuals from the prior year to replace the information needed. But this need not be a big concern because it only affects a really small proportion of the sample. The main big difference transitioning from Q1 to Q2 and the rest of 2020 was the QLFS was, of course, a face-to-face household survey. And from Q2 onwards, it was changed to being administered through CATI, which is the computer-assisted telephonic interviews, for obvious reasons. Great, and because Stats.SA had to transition to using telephonic interview methods, they were only able to sample individuals who they could contact. And this basically included roughly about 71% of individuals who were in the Q1 sample. And these include individuals who had valid contact numbers. So not only individuals who they had contact numbers for, but those who they could actually contact, and the numbers not only rang, but they answered, etc. So this resulted in, for the remainder of 2020, a smaller sample of roughly about 20,000 individuals, well, a reduction of 20,000 individuals. So it went from about 60 or 70,000 to about 40, 50,000. And of course, one of the main concerns for the use of this new sample arises because of selection bias. And what I mean by that is that we are concerned that the households that StatsSA could contact, the so-called telephone households, would be different in characteristics relative to the households who they could not contact. And this presents concerns for when we think about how representative the sample would be when we generate estimates for the population as a whole. Now, StatsSA went into some detail in the documentation that they've published, where they've explicitly stated that they've adjusted the relevant statistical weights using several bias adjustment factors to account for these observable differences between telephone and non-telephone households. The one concern here is that this procedure relied on observational characteristics of these individuals and households that could be measured, and that StatsSA had data on. And there is a concern that there may be underlying differences between households that were surveyed and not surveyed based on characteristics that are unobservable, for instance. Despite this, there's pretty much very little publicly available detail published from StatsSA, and any other external independent review on the statistical weights is yet to be conducted. So throughout this analysis, we do employ these weights because we are interested in population level effects, and we restrict the sample to the working age population. But before delving into the identification strategy and some descriptives, we very briefly explore some population estimates using these weights. So this table just presents the sample sizes and the weighted population estimates for 2020 quarter one and quarter two of distinct subgroups. For example, just looking at the first row, we've got in 2020 quarter one a sample of 66,000 individuals. Again, in 2020 quarter two, sorry, I think someone's mic is on. Is that a question? No, okay. So in 2020 quarter one, we have a sample of about 66,000, 2020 quarter two, a sample of about 47,000. Again, a reduction of 20,000 in the sample, yet the weighted population estimate of those in the working, sorry, not in the working age, but the population as a whole is roughly unchanged between the two quarters, which is what we would expect. We wouldn't expect the size of the population to change within 3 months. Similarly, the working age population estimate is about 39 million, in 2020 quarter one, and just over 39 million in 2020 quarter two, again expected. Where we only see statistically different estimates of the population changing from 2020 quarter one to quarter two is when we consider specific labor market subgroups, which is exactly what we'd expect as a consequence of the pandemic. For example, we see that the labor force is estimated to be about 23.5 million in 2020 quarter one, and in the following quarter it reduces by nearly 5 million to 18.5 million, which is expected in the results that I'll explain next. The point being is that despite these notable reductions in the sample, it appears that the weights that StatsSA have adjusted for seem to be adequate as far as we can tell. The sample in quarter two is 20,000 smaller, but the weighted estimates of population groups appear plausible. But again, just a caveat is that no external review has yet to be conducted, and these adjustments are based off observational characteristics. Right. Cool. So briefly into the identification strategy. Again, I'm going to be brief and happy to touch on this a bit more towards the end of the presentation if anyone wants any more detail. But just to give you a sense of how we went about trying to estimate the causal effect of the lockdown policy in particular, we know that to to estimate a causal effect of any policy or intervention on some outcome of interest, ideally we'd like there to be a randomized allocation of treatment, right? We'd prefer to compare a group, two groups who are observational in every single way, except for the fact that one got treated with some intervention and the other didn't. And then we compare their outcomes. And then because everything else is all equal, we can attribute differences in outcomes to differences in treatment status, hence the causal effect. But we know that the national lockdown in South Africa was not assigned randomly, right? It was, of course, applicable to every worker. However, we do know that when considering the legislation in all the different lockdown levels, we know that being permitted and able to work within a lockdown level varied by the type of job that someone had, right? Which was typically estimated by government using some sort of measure or measures of risk of transmission. So the identification strategy that we use is called the difference in differences model. And essentially what we use, how we estimate the causal effect, is we sort of examine variation between groups, that is, those workers who were permitted and workers who are not permitted to work, be it because it was legislated in the gazettes that they were so, or because of the nature of their work, they were not able to work, or they were able to work. So we compare variation in outcomes between these groups as well as over time, that is, before and after the lockdown. That's in essence a difference in difference. And again, how we identify workers who were permitted to work versus not permitted to work is that we scan the relevant government gazettes for a given lockdown level, and we cross-reference these sub-industries that are listed in the government gazette where people are, or workers are permitted to work or not to work in a given lockdown level. We cross-reference that with the sub-industries that we can identify in the QLFS, which is at the 3-digit level using these standard industrial classification codes. And in doing so, we had to cross-reference just over 150 sub-industries to classify individuals into the treatment group, which are those who are not permitted to work, and the control group who were permitted to work or able to work. How we define able to work is either if individuals report working from home, which is a new variable included in the Q2 QLFS onwards, which we obtained from StatsSA, or if they worked in the public sector, because as we'll see in the descriptive statistics, and arguably individuals in the public sector almost experienced zero net employment loss, exhibited some degree of protection. We note that this might be a sort of controversial decision to take, so we do examine the sensitivity of our results based on these decisions. Right, the pre-period is 2020 Q1 before the lockdown, post is during the first 3 months of lockdown. We combine the difference in difference strategy with a propensity score matching technique, which basically allows us to compare apples with apples. We're worried that those in the treatment group, right, those that were not permitted to work during the lockdown, might differ in characteristics other than treatment status compared to those in the control group, those who were permitted or able to work during the lockdown. So we employ a propensity score matching approach, which in essence allows us to use a set of observational characteristics, and we can estimate the probability that an individual would be classified in the treatment group. And then we basically match individuals in the treatment and control group to one another. Long story short, this basically allows us to get comparable treatment and control groups, at least observationally, based on one indicator, the propensity score, which is simply the probability of being in the treatment group. So yeah, I can go into some details about how we estimate this model, etc., but I won't go into that now, only later if anyone wants any more details. Okay, fantastic. This graph simply just shows a histogram of the treatment and control groups based on their estimated propensity scores from the model. And basically what this tells us is that there seems to be sufficient overlap in propensity scores between the treatment and control group on the match sample, which basically tells us that this procedure seems to have worked well, that the whole process of matching on the propensity score seems to have balanced the covariates between the treatment and control group, i.e., we can argue that at least observationally, on average, people in the treatment and control group are observationally similar to one another. So this should mean that in our models later, we can attribute differences in outcomes, that is employment, to differences in treatment, i.e. the lockdown policy, whether the lockdown policy was applicable to them or not. Okay, so prior to presenting our main results, I'm just going to look at some descriptives here to highlight the immediate changes to the labor market that we'll all be largely familiar with. So this plot just shows trends in key labor market indicators since the beginning of the QLFS in 2008. The key takeaways here are that, of course, employment reduced from Q1 to Q2 in 2020 by 2.2 million people. That is equivalent to a 14% decrease, or in other words, essentially 10 years of job growth gone. Those levels of employment were last seen around 2008 to 2012 when the QLFS began. Second, unemployment experienced an even larger decrease. This is specifically searching unemployment, so the number of people who are unemployed but actively looking for work. That reduced by about 2.7 million people, which is a 40% decrease. And that's not necessarily unexpected given the nature of lockdown policy. It prohibited people from any non-essential activity outside the home, which included often looking for work. And then the third key takeaway, we would argue, would be an even larger, in absolute terms, change in inactivity, and which is represented by the blue line here, an increase in the number of inactive, economically inactive people by more than 5 million, or 33% increase, which again is not unexpected given the nature of the lockdown policy. I've also included in the plot here the unemployment rate, which is the green line. As we can see, and as was notably highlighted in the media, we experienced a severe contraction or reduction in the unemployment rate from 30% to 23% in a quarter, which is the lowest. That 23% represents the lowest unemployment rate since around at least 2008 when the QLFS started. But obviously relying on this indicator is misleading if observed alone. It's a misleading indicator of the health of the labor market if observed alone. And it's simply here, the drop here is just a definitional consequence. We know that the unemployment rate is defined as the number of searching unemployed people as a proportion of the labor force, which is just the sum of the employed and searching unemployed. Both of these factors experienced a drop. Unemployed, as I said, reduced by 2.7 million, but the labor force decreased by an even larger amount, about 5 million in total, hence the drop in the unemployment rate. All right, so we know that these aggregate changes are of course important to consider, but they do hide really important and interesting underlying variation in changes in employment across and within different groups of workers. So when we consider changes geographically, here is just a mapping of the district level changes in net employment loss, again, quarter on quarter in the first 2 quarters of 2020, where darker shades of red represent higher rates of job loss. Although this is on the district level, provincially, might I just add that Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, and the Western Cape collectively experienced the highest amount of job loss, equivalent to about 1.4 million workers, or about just under 2/3 of the total employment loss between the 2 quarters on net. This is not necessarily unexpected given their relatively high national employment shares, but it is notable for just under 1/3 of the total loss in the industry. That's in absolute terms. In relative terms, however, as exhibited more in this graph, we can see that the Northern Cape, Free State, and Limpopo actually were the hardest hit, with the Northern Cape experiencing nearly a 25% decrease in employment, and the Free State and Limpopo experiencing 17% decrease. So going on from this district level analysis, we can use the remaining data from the rest of 2020 to consider how has job loss on the district level compared to job recovery, also on the district level. So in this plot, we present a district level scatter plot. So each point represents one of South Africa's 52 districts. It's color coded by province, and it's weighted by shares of national employment. And what we can see here is basically that the vast majority of districts in the country are based in the upper left quadrant, which implies a severe contraction in the number of people employed and a relatively modest recovery. What I mean by recovery here is of the number of people less employed, right, of the number of jobs lost, so to speak, on net, from 2020 Q1 to Q2, what proportion of those jobs lost had been regained by the end of the year? And we express that in percentage terms to get a recovery rate. So just considering the largest districts, such as eThekwini, Ekurhuleni, City of Joburg, Cape Town, etc., of the largest districts, we observe that eThekwini in KZN experienced the most severe job loss rate of about 17%, followed by in Gauteng, Ekurhuleni, and the City of Joburg, which was about 16 and 14% respectively. On the other hand, although eThekwini in KZN experienced the largest contraction, or the largest job loss rate, they also experienced the highest job recovery rate, 60% specifically. And what I mean by that is of the jobs lost from Q1 to Q2, by the end of the year, eThekwini had gained back 60% of those jobs back over another 2 quarters. In comparison, the City of Cape Town had only recovered a third of the jobs lost, whereas the City of Joburg had only recovered 16%. So again, a lot of decent recovery, but very uneven distribution of recovery and loss. Cool. So we can, of course, observe job loss again from 2020 Q1 to Q2, or year-on-year changes as presented in this table across any group of interests. We could consider by population group or race, by sex or gender, age group, education, etc., as we do in this table. Here we collate our outcomes of, or our categories of interest. So here we specifically look at the number of people employed in the first column within a given category in 2019 Q2, and we compare it to 2020 Q2, and then the latter 4 columns basically compare these changes over time using different measures. What I'd like to highlight in particular is that we do see very specific concentrated effects amongst specific groups. The first bit that I've highlighted here is amongst the youth. The youth accounted for just over half, nearly 51% of total jobs lost between 2020 Q1 and Q2. And this is of particular concern given that prior to the pandemic, they only represented about 36% of the of total employment in the country. So quite literally a disproportionate effect on the youth. Similarly, when we compare employment shares and the share of change for different groups, we can see that there have been disproportionate effects on the on workers who are informally employed. Here, if we regard or define that as workers who are informally employed, and we include workers in private households, including domestic workers, we see that this group, the informally employed workers, accounted for also over half of total employment loss. So that's just over 1 million people, fewer people employed. But collectively, they only represented about 27% of employment prior to the pandemic. Similarly, and more severely, The private sector, almost all the reduction in net employment can be observed in the private sector, about 94%, despite representing about 83% of employment in the country prior to the pandemic. And similarly, union members, we actually saw some growth in employment, at least on net, of the number of workers who were union members, from about 3.9 million a year before the beginning of the pandemic, and then 4.2 million. Whereas amongst union non-members, we saw 95% of the contraction was experienced by them. So it seems like union membership, at least descriptively, might have provided some protection against the pandemic, but that is very, very preliminary and just descriptive evidence, nothing causal there necessarily. Anyway, the point of this is that we can see that the effects of the pandemic were incredibly uneven and typically were borne out most by those already vulnerable. We can explore this amongst a host of different groups, and we do in the paper. For instance, we see that the secondary sector, construction and manufacturing, for instance, were disproportionately affected, and also notably semi and less skilled workers relative to high skilled workers. So these include workers such as bricklayers, motor vehicle mechanics, building electricians, and less skilled workers such as domestic workers, laborers, manufacturing laborers, helpers and cleaners, etc. Yeah. Cool. So moving on from the descriptive evidence, we move on to our main model and our main question of interest here, which is again, well, what role did our national lockdown policy have in the aggregate employment effect of 2.2 less people, fewer people employed in the span of one quarter? So this table here just presents the number of people employed in our treatment and control group, right? So those permitted and not permitted to work in the pre-lockdown period, Q1, and as well as the first 3 months of the lockdown in Q2. We have the sample sizes here as well as the weighted estimates. So if we look at the bottom row of the table, in the first column, we see that there were about 7.3 million people employed in the treatment group in the pre-lockdown period, which essentially says that we estimated that there were about 7.3 million people who were under a lockdown scenario, as per our policy, not permitted to work in 2020 Q1. This reduced to, in the fourth column, from 7.3 million to 5.5 million in the second quarter, which is a significant reduction. In the control group, that is people who were permitted or able to work, we see that there were about 9 million people in the prior to the lockdown estimated that were employed, and this also reduced to about 8.6 million during the lockdown. So both of these groups experienced a reduction in net employment. However, we see a much larger reduction amongst the treatment group, specifically nearly 25% relative to the control group, which is about 5%. So that's a nearly 5 times larger reduction in employment amongst the treatment group. This is indicative of a significant treatment effect of the lockdown policy itself, right? Because the only differences that we'd like between these groups would be whether or not one was affected by the policy or not. However, this table is simply descriptive in nature, and although alludes to a significant causal effect, need not be interpreted as such. We go into that next. So in our model that we use to identify the causal effect, the difference in difference, a key identifying assumption is called the parallel trends assumption, which basically states that in the absence of treatment, in this case, the lockdown policy, those in the treatment group, i.e. those who were not permitted to work, would have followed similar trends in employment to those who are in the control group, i.e. people who were not permitted to work would have followed similar employment trends to those who were able and permitted to work in the absence of a lockdown. This is how we sort of exploit the data to estimate a causal effect here. And one way to check this pretty neatly and visually is through the use of an event study plot here, which is essentially where we use linear regression through OLS, and we regress a binary variable for employment, represented in the probability of employment, on an interaction term, to be specific, between a treatment binary indicator and a period, a set of period dummies. Yeah. So not to go into too much detail, but this plot essentially shows us that in the pre-treatment period, which is to the left of the zero vertical line, right, which is before 2020 Q2 when the lockdown was implemented, we see that every estimate, although it varies between being above zero or lower than zero, the 95% confidence intervals represented by the cap spikes all overlap zero, which tells us that the estimates are not statistically significantly different from zero. What this implies is that in the pre-treatment period before lockdown was implemented, our treatment and control groups, on average, workers who were permitted and not permitted to work, experience statistically similar probabilities of being employed, which is indicative of the parallel trends assumption holding for our analysis, which is great news for us. Yeah. And then what's great about event study plots as well, besides from analyzing pre-treatment trends and outcomes between the groups, is that it also allows us to visually check the degree of the effect in the post-treatment period, which is basically the effect of the lockdown policy. And as we can see here to the right of the red vertical line, that period is 2020 Q2, once the lockdown had been implemented. And we see a significant reduction in the estimate of the probability of being employed, which tells us that individuals in the treatment group on average experienced a reduction in employment relative to those in the control group in the lockdown period. And the 95% confidence intervals don't overlap or don't cross zero, which means this is a statistically significant estimate. However, this event study plot here is unconditional in nature. It's prior to us using the propensity score matching procedure to obtain comparable treatment and control groups. And we don't yet control for a vector of covariates and individual fixed effects, which we do include in our difference in difference model. So in that light, we move on to present the main estimate of interest. So this table presents our difference in difference estimates of the effect of the lockdown policy on the probability of employment. We run 6 different models here, and the model of interest here is in column 6, where the coefficient of interest is the interaction between the treatment dummy and the post dummy. So the estimate of interest is that negative 0.08 there. With the 3 stars next to it. So what that effect implies is that the lockdown policy caused a 8 percentage point reduction in the probability of employment amongst those not permitted to work relative to those who were or able to during the lockdown period. And that is a statistically significant difference at the 1% level. And in this model, we control for a vector of observable covariates, including age, gender, marital status, occupation, industry. Oh, we don't control for industry because that's related to our treatment assignment, but type of employment contract, informality, etc., as well as individual fixed effects, which we're able to do because the QLFS turned into a longitudinal, sort of quasi-longitudinal survey from during 2020. So we can use this estimate to interpret the magnitude of this effect in a more palatable way. So taking the 8 percentage point effect, considering that it's regarded as an average treatment effect on the treated, we compare the 8 percentage point effect to the reduction in employment exhibited amongst the control group. And long story short, we can translate this effect into meaning that the policy caused about 600,000 fewer people to be employed on net during the lockdown period. In other words, of the 2.2 million people million fewer people employed in 2020 quarter two, the lockdown policy, we argue, it directly accounted for about 26% of total employment loss. This is a notable finding that we argue. This essentially means that about 1 in every 4 workers who lost their job on net was due to the lockdown policy specifically. And what this also suggests is that although lockdown policy obviously plays a very important role, this does suggest that the majority of job loss can be attributed to other pandemic-related factors, such as consumer or producer behavioral responses or foreign policy, the effects of other countries' lockdowns on us, etc. So moving on from that, it is plausible that this main average effect can vary between different groups of workers, especially amongst those considered vulnerable in the labor market. So what we can do, given our data restrictions, is we can interact our difference in difference term in our equation with some sort of binary indicator for select subgroups. We choose to do this for men versus women, people in urban versus rural areas, people who are regarded as youth versus non-youths, those who have either completed a secondary, have their matric or more, or don't, own account workers versus employees, and low skilled workers versus, or less skilled workers rather, versus semi and high skilled workers. What I'd like to highlight here in particular is that we find 2 statistically significant effects amongst subgroups, but one in particular is of concern. If you look at the estimate for in the gray bar there, it's a negative 0.224 estimate, which is significant at the 1% level, which implies a 22.4 percentage point reduction in the probability of employment amongst own account workers versus employees. This effect is nearly 3 times larger than that 8 percentage point effect that we observed in our main results. Now, we couldn't look at informal versus formal sector workers in the specification because of data limitations. So we use own account workers to proxy for the informal sector. We argue that this is somewhat appropriate because nearly 90% of own account workers are based in the informal sector. So we argue that this effect is an indicator of the vulnerability of the informal sector to the lockdown policy. Specifically, just to reiterate, workers in the informal sector, so to speak, experienced an effect that was 3 times larger than the overall average treatment effect of the policy for the average worker. Other than that, we don't experience any evidence of heterogeneity in effects by sex, level of education, age group, or skill. Now, our main results of that 8 percentage point effect, or the lockdown accounting for 26% of total jobs lost, is of course related to certain assumptions we make on the model. For instance, how do we define our control group, and what definition of employment do we use? So in the paper, we employ a number of sensitivity or robustness tests to examine the sensitivity of our results to these choices that we make. For instance, you see our main estimate there at the top of this figure, which is a coefficient plot. Our main estimate of 8 percentage points is there at the top, and the red line represents the magnitude of the main estimate. In our main estimate, for instance, regarding control groups, we again define individuals as being in the treatment group if they were not permitted to work, and being in the control group if they were permitted to work by legislation, or they were in the public sector, or they work from home. So we disaggregate that control group and use different control groups to see how the estimate changes. For instance, in that second row, so to speak, the second dot from the top, the control group is just those who were permitted to work. The one below that is where they were permitted to work and they're in the public sector. Well, not and, or they're in the public sector. And then the third one is they're permitted to work or they work from home. So varying from our main estimate. And we can see that the estimate remains statistically significant from 0 and is negative, and the 95% confidence intervals they do overlap with our main estimate of 8 percentage points. So that suggests that our estimate is somewhat sensitive to control group definitions, but our overall finding still holds. We next work on a few different definitions of employment, for example, at the bottom, or industry assumptions. What I mean by industry assumptions is that in our main analysis, there were, of course, in the government gazettes, certain industries where workers were permitted to work, but only at a specific capacity. For instance, an industry, a sub-agriculture industry would only be permitted to work up to 50% of capacity and not otherwise. So we assumed in our main model that if an industry's legislated capacity was at least 50%, we would regard them as being permitted to work. So we put them we assign individuals in that industry in the control group and not otherwise. This is, of course, an arbitrary threshold, and it has implications on who's in the control group. So we use a bunch of different definitions to assign people into the control group based on different thresholds. And we basically find about 5 estimates that are, again, all negative, all statistically significant from 0, and none of which are statistically significantly different from our main estimate. Lastly, one concern during a lockdown period is that the conventional definition of employment may not be appropriate. So our main outcome variable here in these models is employment. It's a binary employment variable, which codes people as 1 if they're employed and 0 otherwise. And what we mean by employed here is that if they've, based on the standard conventional Stats SA definition, which is based on IOL standards. This definition includes people who are employed, they have a working relationship or a relationship with their employer, but they have been temporarily absent from work during the reference week. Usually this group, as stated by a few other researchers like Vimal Ranchard and Reza Daniels as part of the NIDS-CRAM study, usually this group is pretty small. For example, in 2020 Q1, they represent less than 1% of the employed, these absentee workers. And most of them, about half, are because they say they're on vacation leave. But in the lockdown context, this might not necessarily be an appropriate definition of employment to include this group of workers in there, because of course, absentee workers can now include workers who have been furloughed from work. That is, they've maintained an employment relationship, they are on leave temporarily, so to speak. So arguably in a lockdown, they're no longer negligible. For instance, in Q2, up from less than 1%, now 6% of the employed were regarded as absentee workers, were temporarily absent from work. And most of them, 86%, didn't say they were on vacation leave. They said this was due to other reasons other than vacation leave or sick leave, etc. So largely likely due to the lockdown. So the last 3 estimates towards the bottom of the graph, we use different employment definitions to examine the sensitivity of our findings. And again, we find that regardless of what we do, whether we only regard people as employed if they're working for pay, cash or in kind, or if they're only employed if they're working and they work positive number of working hours, or if we exclude absentee workers entirely, we consistently find a statistically significant and negative effect. Cool, so quickly summarizing in 2 slides of conclusions. We know that South Africa's lockdown policy was always expected to result in substantial economic costs, and this is reflected in the labor market. A comprehensive collection of descriptive studies now exist, which shows how groups of workers were differently affected in the labor market, and they consistently show that vulnerable groups were disproportionately affected. Although these studies are all important in their own rights and have been super important in highlighting the uneven nature of job loss and recovery in the country, they're all descriptive in nature. So they unfortunately, not that it's necessarily their goal, but they can't allude net changes in employment, but from before to during the pandemic, they can't attribute that to the national lockdown because of all the events that happened at the same time. Broadly, sure, to the pandemic as a whole, but we know that pandemic-related events consisted of South Africa's national lockdown policy, and employment in the country can also be influenced not only by lockdown policy, but other outcomes or events that happened at the same time, such as other countries' foreign policy or their own lockdown policies, mortality and morbidity within the country, or consumer and producer behavior, for instance, fear or aversion of interacting or participating in the economy, which has knock-off effects on the labor market. So in this paper, we've attempted to use a very specific identification strategy to isolate and estimate the short-term causal effect of South Africa's lockdown policy, specifically on employment, by cross-referencing the relevant government gazettes with the 3-digit sub-industry codes within the QLFS. And again, our main findings show that the national lockdown policy itself had a significant and negative effect on the probability of employment, specifically 8 percentage points, and that this estimate is fairly robust to a wide range of sensitivity tests. In other words, we can translate this effect to represent about 600,000 jobs lost or fewer people employed, which in essence speaks to the national lockdown policy itself directly accounting for just over a quarter of the 2.2 million jobs lost from 2020 Q1 to Q2. So this suggests that lockdowns per se need not account for the majority of job loss. There are a whole range of other factors to consider here. It might also suggest that demand shocks, labor demand shocks, might play a more integral role than supply side restrictions like a lockdown. We note that the estimated effect that we get is larger, significantly larger for informal workers and also for more stringent lockdown levels, which I didn't show in this slide just for brevity. Any future policy considerations as a third wave potentially emerges in the country? What we would say is that, of course, lockdown policy still matters and still plays an important role in job loss and recovery in the labor market. 600,000 jobs is not a small amount. It's nearly equivalent to the number of jobs lost on net during the global financial crisis of 2008. But of course, policy considerations, any sort of targeted relief or policy ought to be dependent on, broadly speaking, the extent of job recovery or labor market recovery, as well as the distribution thereof across different types of workers. In future work, we aim to and are busy with extending this analysis to other outcomes other than employment, such as the probability of being unemployed or being economically inactive, as well as intensive margin outcomes amongst those who manage to remain in employment, that is, their working hours and their wages. The latter of which will allow us to also estimate how these effects of the lockdown varied across the wage distribution, which is, I think, of particular interest, at least for us, for South Africa, given the extent of income inequality, and we know that wage inequality is the predominant driver of income inequality. Cool, thank you.